Gregg Stebben here with Ilya Ponomarev. It's been a few weeks since we've talked, Ilya. It's great to see you again.
Nice to finally see you. Yes, we were so busy with the Congress and with my travels, so I'm really sorry that I missed several of our endeavors.
So here we are. We're back again at our usual time. Obviously, the first thing for us to talk about is the Congress, which was held from the 20th to the 23rd of February, leading right up to the anniversary of the Russian invasion. Tell us about what happened there.
The Congress went really well. We doubled in size, which was really good. And it was very professional. I think that the professional level of the documents that were discussed and prepared by the Congress also increased. And they were very important ones. We passed in the final reading the law on freedom of speech, which is the fundamental law, obviously, for future Russia. And we also passed in the final reading the law on lustrations, which basically sets the parameters of the future denazification of Russia and cleansing of Russian elites from Putinists and from people who were making war crimes in Ukraine and who actually led the country to the situation which we see right now. And besides that, we started discussing the transition plan, the roadmap for the changes in Russia, passed them in the first reading as a concept, which defines how Russia would transit from the current authoritarian state to the future democracy. And we passed the very fundamental bill, which is Bill of Rights, which is the foundation for the future constitution. And we started discussing this future constitution. So I think that we are progressing quite well. The next Congress would be held somewhere in June this year. And we hope that our numbers would grow once again.
I'm very biased, obviously. I was born and raised in the United States. I'm a citizen of the United States. As you're describing your work there, and having been there at the first Congress myself in Warsaw, every time I think about the Congress, what I am reminded of is the founding fathers of the United States doing similar work with, I would like to say, great outcome, as we know this will have great outcome as well. I'd like to suggest, I'm saying this somewhat in jest, but I'd like to suggest that the next Congress be held in Philadelphia, where the founding fathers of the U.S. met, perhaps even in the same hall if it could be arranged. I'm always trying to connect the dots for people between the founding fathers of the U.S. and the work they did and the work you're doing there with the first Congress, or with the Congress of People's Deputies.
Also that's a very pleasant comparison, which is very close to my heart as well. And I think it should be accurate, the history would tell. And that's definitely for us the example to follow. That's exactly the example that we're trying to recreate, and in the approaches in other constitution, we are trying to take many of the examples from the history of the United States and the approaches that were there, and in the most fundamental thing in the layout of the regions in the federal structure of future Russia, the example of the United States is exactly the one that we are following. So rights to the region, power to the regions, all the key decisions to the regions, and only a very limited set of authority to the center, what is related to the national defense or national infrastructure, stuff like this, but as much as possible go to the regions. And many other, by the way, examples we were discussing. The layout of the future parliament, bicameral structure, which also resembles the structure of the House of Representatives and the Senate in the United States, with the terms, the judicial system. We are taking a lot of positive examples from the states. We introducing the judges, the elected judges. We introducing the elected sheriffs. And many things like this. So power to the people. It's actually very funny. It's one of the most debated features of the current American system. The Second Amendment went into our new constitution without any debate. It was unanimously supported by the Congress. So we now have exactly the same thing in our constitution, and I do believe that it's the right thing to do. Despite all the controversy that it creates in the states, I really think that you guys just have nothing to compare it with, and I think it's a positive thing.
To that, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, and then many other things, because also things which are being discussed currently in the states about the same-sex marriages, for example, the rights to abortion and whatever. We also took the approach that it has to be decided by the regions. It has to be the general framework. It has to be a certain guarantees on the federal level, and these guarantees say that it should be no discrimination on the basis of gender, and the person has the right to decide about his own body. But at the same time, the exact policies, they need to be decided on the states level, so on the regions level in the Russian case.
One of the things I want to ask you about, and I want to come back to some things you talked about relative to the Congress, but for now, I want to make a transition from what you said a few minutes ago about, one of the most important laws that has been taken up by the Congress is the freedom of speech. You and I have talked about this before, how it is such a fundamental thing that must be, captured in law in a rock solid way. Is there a comparison to be drawn between the work you're doing and the recognition you as a body see for freedom of speech, and I'm including in that freedom of media, and what is happening in Georgia right now?
I wouldn't say that there is a direct connection, although there is one. And this connection is what the protests in Georgia are all about is on the law that they call themselves FARA, as it is in the United States, the law on the foreign agents. And obviously they are copying Russian approach, not the United States approach. They are referring to the United States, but they're copying the Russian approach. In the United States, this law that was passed in 1930s, if I'm not mistaken, in 1938, it was a law which was to prevent Nazi propaganda within the United States, that was preventing fascist influence inside the country. And it was actually applied something like 10 times. And after the war, it was applied like 2 times. And that was it, because it was very, very, very precise. And many attempts later to apply the law, they all actually failed. In Russia, it's one of the most wide applicable laws at the moment. And all Russian journalists and all Russian political activists, they know that if they are unloyal to Mr. Putin, they would be branded foreign agents. And it's like yellow David star in the concentration camps that you are supposed to wear with you all the time. No matter what you say, no matter whether you appear, you will be branded that you are the foreign agent. And in Russian, this combination foreign agent, it's more like a traitor, the way it sounds. So it's even worse than it is in the United States. And Georgians, obviously, the current Georgian leadership, they were preparing for the future elections, which are to take place there in 2024, and they wanted to use Russian example to clean up from all the opposition. And it's very funny, actually. I was speaking yesterday on the Georgian TV about this because obviously I was one of the main people who were fighting against this law in Russia. And I was asking them a question how the Georgian leadership actually explains the introduction of this law. This law definitely is targeted against somebody who is a threat to national security, who wants to influence the country illegally, to steer it away. So when it was introduced in the United States, it was very clearly said, this is the law against Nazis, against Nazi Germany, and against their agents of influence. When it was introduced by Putin, it was also pretty clearly said, it's the law against the consolidated West, the NATO, and their proxies inside Russia. It's very clear because Putin considered them to be the threat for the national security, and that was openly said. These are the bad guys, whom we want to protect ourselves from. For Georgians, the only real threat for Georgia at the moment is Russia, who actually invaded the territory and created the war, etc. But no, they were not saying, as the pro-Russian government was not saying that it's the law against Russia. They also were saying that it's some illegal Western influence. These are somebody who would be neglecting our Orthodox Church, Georgian Orthodox Church, our core family values, and stuff like this. But okay, you guys in Georgia, you officially said that you want to be a part of NATO and you want to be part of European Union. Then whom you are protecting yourself from? And that's obviously this contradiction resulted in the mass protest. And I am happy to say that the protesters were victorious, and the parliament actually withdrew. They cancelled this piece of legislation, want to say piece of something else, and but it's a very good news. That means that in Georgia, democracy is still alive.
Does the size of those protests and the success of those protests, is this meaningful and another piece of a puzzle that begins to significantly chip away at Mr. Putin's position in Russia?
Well, obviously, it's a powerful example. It's very inspiring to many of the members of the Russian opposition. Everybody is discussing this thing right now. But at the same time, we need to say that also when people compare, they say, because Georgian authorities are weak, because Georgian authorities did not use the firearms, because Georgians are not that oppressive against their own people, that it's not such a long period of time passed since this current government is in place. That's why they did not manage to consolidate the elites as much as it happened in Russia. So I am afraid that many of the representatives of the Russian opposition, when the euphoria would pass, they would find themselves another excuse why they shouldn't act like Georgians did.
Oh, it's not exactly what I was asking you, but it's actually even more interesting, because you're really making the case for, I'm going to say, other than some select groups, excuse me, like for instance yourself and your Congress. There's a lot of people who are opposition in voice, but not in action. But is what's happening in Georgia any kind of an actual sign of loss of power for Putin himself? Is it significant to him?
I think it's a little bit. It definitely is, but I don't think it would have a tremendous impact. I think that his attention is fully associated right now with Ukraine and everything that is happening around Ukraine. I think that he would, by Putin's psychology, he would basically, I think, take it as he was taking actions of Mr. Yanukovych in Ukraine before 2014.
I was going to draw the
Yeah,
comparison. Yes.
Yeah, that's the loser guy. He couldn't control his own people. He should be tougher than that. He should take lessons from me. Because it went unprepared. They thought it's so easy, but it's not so easy. They need to study more. Yeah, what a bunch of losers. I think that would be more or less what he would think about this.
What an amazing thing. You've once again shown me how Putin takes a negative and turns it into a positive for himself. He's a master of spin. I am wondering, do people inside of Russia have an awareness of what's been happening in Georgia?
No, yeah, definitely. For Russians, it would be explained as just another Orange Revolution type scenario. That it's the influence of the West. Look how strong our leader is, and look how pitiful their leaders are. And it's funny because there is such a meme in Russia with Putin when he was commenting on the Yellow Jackets protests in Paris. He once dropped such a phrase. So you guys want like in Paris? And then it was like, or you guys want like in Kiev? And now everybody is saying, you guys want like in Tbilisi? And people say, yes, we do want like in Tbilisi.
Interesting.
And by the way, how in Paris, it's not so bad either.
Yes. Is the introduction of this law in Georgia timed to be a deliberate distraction for Putin to take the world's attention away from something related to Ukraine?
No, I don't think so. I think it's rather a conspiracy. No, I don't think so. I think it was very locally motivated by the Georgian authorities. I don't think they take as much advice from Putin these days because they have a lot of internal problems inside Georgia. It's the power really is not as consolidated as it is in Russia. They have a stronger position. The elites are split. And despite that, Ivanishvili, the unofficial Georgian leader, definitely is inclined to be pro-Russian, at least pro-Russian in style.
Yes.
But he cannot demonstrate it publicly because publicly still overwhelming majority of Georgians is very much inclined to move towards the European Union and NATO, and he cannot just ignore it. Even in this situation with those protests, so the parliament voted for it, but the Georgian president, who was supported by Ivanishvili when she was elected, obviously, despite that she was from former Saakashvili's team, but she kind of like switched sides and was supported by Ivanishvili. But she said she would veto this piece of law as soon as it would be passed. And the parliament said, okay, if she would veto it, then the parliament would override the veto. But it was not clear whether they would be getting enough votes for this. But still, it was so the elite is not united, and
Yes.
That's the indication that it is not guided from the outside. It's their internal politics.
All right, I want to bring you back to the Congress. You mentioned the transition plan. What can you tell us about the transition plan?
No, the transition plan consists basically of two major blocks, before and after the Constitution would be passed. And before the Constitution would be passed, so the transition plan in general covers 2 years. So the transition period is anticipated to be 2 years. The moment of change in power and the moment when it's the new parliament is being created and this new parliament appoints the new government. So what is happening from the very beginning? Obviously, it's the occupation of Ukraine. downsizing the military, abandoning of FSB, the modern the incarnation of KGB, the release of political prisoners, making the lists of political spies, the internal agents who were reporting to KGB public, illustration, and that's like the initial push. One of the, by the way, ironic things, it's because obviously there is a lot of ideological debate, and I am known to be on the left-wing side of the politics, and I would say that the majority of the Congress is on the right side. And one of the most radical right-wingers said, you know, looking at this transition period, I see a left-wing propaganda there. I don't know what he was referring to, why it's so left-wing. Was nonsense anyway. But the funny thing is that I am being the left wing. I introduced the amendment that we need to finally bury Vladimir Lenin and vacate the mausoleum on the Red Square and make there the museum of mass repressions. And just my left wing take that we should take all the periods of time from Russian Empire to the Soviet Union to the Putinist Russia, because political oppression was all the time. So let us make the museum of political oppression of all time, and that would be in the very center of Moscow, which would be very, very symbolic. So that's one of the amendments that actually got there, and that's now a part of the decision. But seriously speaking, probably the key thing during the first year is the municipal reform. We want to start from the municipal elections. So again, to give power to the people, to the localities, to the local communities, and to make them feel this power, so get them this taste, which is extremely important, because then it will be harder to take it out, you know, yes, by whatever government would be in place. The real power and the real money which is associated with this power. Then it's the passing of the new constitution, and this new constitution is also like a vote of trust on behalf of the regions. So which of the regions want to stay and which of the regions want to go.
And when you say the passing of the constitution, you don't mean just by the Congress, but by the people themselves.
No, by the people, obviously, yes, on the public referendum. And before that, it should be preceded by a crowdsourcing exercise. So we want people to be involved, to be engaged in actually drafting the constitution. But at the end of the day, one of the essential parts of the constitution is this federal relationship within the country. Yes. And that means that all the regions, they are to take a conscious decision. They need to debate throughout the year whether they want to stay or whether they want to go. And those regions which are voting against the constitution, that means they're becoming independent states. And no thanks, no oppression. You know, it's legitimate people's decision whether they want to stay within such a country or whether they want to split away. I do not expect many of the regions to go away, frankly speaking, but that may happen with several, and we should respect this people's decision. And then the second year after the constitution is passed, according to the new constitution, is the formation of the political parties. It's the federal political campaign, the federal elections, and through the elections, the new parliament is to be formed, and the new parliament is to appoint the new government, and the prime minister would be the head of the state. Most likely, the position of the president would be abolished. We still, this debate is ahead of us, but based on the current mood at the Congress, I think that the majority would suggest the people of Russia to abolish the position of president altogether.
Is part of the abolishment of the position of president sort of a cleansing of the past?
Yeah, it's cleansing of the past. That's from the very beginning. It's this lustration law that would start happening from the very first day. And our take is that this lustration is a kind of a national compromise, so that there is no mass oppression, so people are not going to jail. We are only sending to a new Nuremberg trial those who were involved in the military crimes, and but maybe several hundred, maybe 1,000, but
Yes.
not more than that. But people who were involved in this regime, there were millions. And we need to make sure that they are no longer part of the political life. So they have limitations as a citizen. They have no limitations in terms of making business, enjoy life, grow up kids, they are free people. They can travel, they can other places if they want, but they are restricted in several activities. They are restricted in their right to participate in the political life, and they also restricted in the right to participate in the public life. Yes, there were people of culture who were campaigning for the war and for mass killings of Ukrainians. There were teachers who were falsifying the elections. Yes. So those teachers are not supposed to teach anymore. Those actors are not supposed to act anymore. Those directors are not supposed to shoot their movies anymore. It's it's very similar to what happened after World War II in Germany, and unfortunately, several of the real geniuses, like Leni Riefenstahl, for example, was a genius film director, but she was banned from making any more movies because she was campaigning for Hitler and was actually doing her best to create a positive image of that horrible regime. And that was the punishment, which I think is the capital punishment for a person of culture, is to stop publicly performing.
I want to ask you about two more things. Before I move on, though, I do want to make the point that almost everything we've just talked about in this discussion of the transition is in your book, of course, Does Putin Have to Die? How Russia Becomes a Democracy After Losing to Ukraine. So that's a great resource, that really shows in writing that this has been a long time coming. And it's evolving now literally as we speak. And that makes it very exciting for us to watch. Sure, it's quite exhilarating for you who are participating. I have to confess, when I asked you about the transition plan, I was thinking of the transition plan between today and the end of Putin, not the transition plan from the end of Putin to the end of 2 years. Is there anything you want to say about, you've written a book called Does Putin Have to Die? Is there anything you want to say about the period from today to the day he's no longer in power in Russia?
Right now, it's a way simpler answer for transition from modern day Russia to democracy. For today, it's just two basic recipes. We need to fight, and to fight with arms, and that's what our guys are doing in the front lines in Ukraine and partisans inside Russia. And the second thing to do is to create a political alternative, and that's what Congress is doing. So these two things are basically the only two pillars on which to build, and that's what we need to do.
All right, the last thing I want to ask you about is a story in the Washington Post today. Do I have the headline here? I don't have the headline, but you are mentioned in this story about Ukrainian covert operations. It centers around some alleged revelations about the Nord Stream. I don't know what happened. There's people who are suggesting one thing or another, but the story then talks about. Right. But my real question for you is, why shouldn't Ukraine be involved in covert operations? They've been invaded.
Absolutely. I don't see the point. I think that we should be involved. We should make attacks on the territory of Russia. Just the only thing that no civilians should be hurt. All others, other actions are legitimate. If we are fighting against the means of war, about the sources of finances for the war, if we are fighting against the people of war, the propaganda guys and people with arms or unarmed but still campaigning for the war, these all are legitimate targets. And again, the Congress passed an act on resistance movement where it put very clear framework of what should and should not be done. And this framework is extremely simple. We shouldn't do something that would hurt civilians. That's the end of the story. Everything else that would stop the war, that's legitimate.
All right. Anything else you want to add before I let you go today?
No, I think that's we've covered it all, and follow the Congress, read the book. Those who prefer it in Russia, I have a video version in Russian, which has been published on my YouTube channel, my personal YouTube channel, Ilya Ponomarev, which is very easy to find, Ilya Ponomarev. And I hope that we'll meet next week now without any problems.
I look forward to it. It's great to see you again. We look forward to hearing about in continued progress and positive motion, positive movement in the world, both for Ukraine and for Russia, frankly, a democratic Russia. So with that, I'll let you go. Thank you for joining me this morning, Ilya.
Thanks for everyone to watch us.